ね、いやー、このプリキュア説明するわ。しようか。
And I think that here in the Nordic countries, it's fantastic to be an entrepreneur because you're not, if you fail, you're not going to find yourself without.
日本政府の命令でやったと発覚しました。
You have a safety net. You can go out there and you can try again and again, and before you know it, you build your.
これどういうことだこれ。これまあ。これ知ってたな。あんまいい加減にしろお前。クレミサだ。お前もいい加減にしろ政権女。連行したいよな俺。俺説明しろ。俺間違ってスタートインクルの見てもったぞ映画。知ってたのか藤井裕二。お前が命令したのかこれ。こうなると架空世界だ。そのミラクガイと架空兵器やろ。父さん知ってましたよ。ジャニーズ事務所の皆さん。ファイナルウォーズパーになったんでしょ。パーになったでしょ。さあこのプリキュアのせいでパーになったんやろ。キングコング VS ゴジラいかないか500万から1000万いくって分かりますよ。そう観客動員数いったらそうおみやまピーたちやっぱこれ恨んでたでしょ。やっぱりな。やっぱ滋賀県恨んでたか。わかる。これ藤井裕二が起訴しない代わりに措置するってとんでもない取引した。とんでもない取引した。藤村光栄たちあとあんなはずみやいいわ。さあこの時に俺通報来ましたよ。7月7日にさあ偶然にも2ヶ月後に発表。藤井裕二らがやりました。山内勝平もやりました。ハラミ系らももちろんな。ハグッとプリキュアの声優陣も共謀してました。榎本敦子反省してないって分かった。井上まりだとこいつらがやりました。こいつも共謀した。こいつもです。バーニングの命令でやったって発覚しました。そう行くわ。覚悟しろお前。対テロ冷静やん。これそっちに義務化してたんか。そういうわけなモストカンパニーの立ち位置高しどうするんだ。これ知ってたのか。この前どんなんこれ知ってたのかお前ら。やっぱアスカキラーの命令かこれ。すごい覚悟あるよな俺。児玉育を覚悟しろ俺。児玉育をバーニング恩時を覚悟しろ。お前らが命令したんか。さすが芸能界のテロ組織バーニング覚悟しろ俺。 謝って済むんねんやボケ。厚生労働省お前もや。かなり広いことだと障害者の無料接種券知ってるぞ。ホストカンパニーの立ち位置高し知ってたのかこれ。知った上で俺を逮捕したんか。今回はさすがにな、滋賀県警察本部も切るしかやな。大津地方検察庁もさすがにさ、もう同じ手は機関って言ったんさ。ほんで安倍晋三がなんで蓮見明さあ医療の福祉を操作してくれて言ったんやさ。恐ろしいことに本当に病気発病しまた。最悪な結果やったさ。これが現実や。これが起こってもたんや。かなえ知ってたのか。入院お前も通報したんか。
But of course, with the changing climate, with countries not respecting WTO rules, countries going increasingly bilateral, there is a challenge there. So we are looking at how to reform our policies, of course, to be still able to do trade agreements, to strengthen the WTO and reform it with other like-minded countries, but also to protect ourselves against countries who are not playing according to the rules, and to make sure that the European the level playing field is respected. We have changed our trade defense mechanisms. We have implemented a coordination mechanism for investment screening, and we are looking at how to sharpen our tools. And this will be a key issue for the new Commission coming in as well.
Brexit. やっとことの重大さに気づいたか。
I think the truthful answer is that we will know with the general election on the 12th of December the time to complete the first chapter. Either Boris Johnson will win, in which case Britain will exit the European Union on or about.
わかったかこれ。もう日本政府に圧力かけろってさ。笑い事です。残念だけど自衛隊も。はい。はい、もうそういうことや。JI の参加。ここのことですか。JI の目指すまんね。水木な、お前知ってたのか。殺人未遂やぞこれ。お前まさかアンライブのおっそり滋賀県に来てたと言わせんぞ。あの前原駅で辰巳がまさか鉢合わせに去ったと言わせんぞ。ミキ、お前いい加減にしろ。おい、雪のさつきか。おい、雪のさつき。ああ、もういたいた。さあ、もういといた。さあ。高橋メアリー順ばっかり。そう、集中。俺と西川貴教、高橋メアリー順。知ってたのか、お前ら。知ってたのか。お前の映画。
train the new generations of in the
あら、言われるぞ。
we know that we need to create materials that are a lot more engaging, that are a lot more useful, and that are going to have an impact in the way that they learn and in the way that they acquire the new skills that they need in order to remain competitive in the marketplace.
ある休み軍なん
What a better way to do that than through video games? As children, we learn through playing, and we believe that through gamification and through game-based learning, we can make learning
そういうこ
fun
とや。
again, not only for
そ
children,
ういう
which
こ
we
とや。
know is the
日本
best
政府がやったってこ
but
とか。
also from adults.
この前、アヒート天皇。アヒート上皇。この前行くと、天皇制廃止だたいぞ。
As I said earlier, they would also acquire that knowledge much more deeply, and they will be able to apply that knowledge in their daily jobs. And finally, by doing the video games through the
セーブあるか。
simulators, they will be able to have experiential
はい、しまい
learning,
見るが。
feedback on what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong, and learn from that.
ごめんな。水飴、お前、今アメリカにいるの知ってるぞ。残念だな。そのセーバーの本体は。
It's a necessity.
どこにいるか教えようか。
Water scarcity, when you look at
ど
waste
こにいるか
pollution,
教えようか。
everybody is now aware of that. If we want to make a conciliation between the planet for our children
そう、
and
ヨーロッパに
economic
いる。
development, we need to move towards a secular economy. And by education,
この
by
YouTube どこに流れてるかわかる。
by a different way of doing business,
フランス共和国の
both
首
for
都。
citizens and also by
首都パリ
companies,
つま
we will
り
make this move, which
フ
will
ランス版のビル
help
ダーバー
us
グたるさ
collectively to have
あ
a
いうあうらいの
planet
本部のあるの
again.
ありますあるんや残念だったなお前らそこ行ってるよな残念だけどそこは物気の殻でしたまあこういうことだよ
The future of entertainment in the 21st century is going to be shaped by the twin forces of globalization and digitalization, both of which are going to be terrific for consumers. Digitalization means that people will be able to consume entertainment wherever and whenever they want, and globalization means that that opportunity will be given to people around the globe.
ああちなみにこのアメリカ軍ねだいぶ
Large companies are going
ね
to
ほとんど
dominate the future of
セーブあるね
the
メー
entertainment
ガン
landscape.
さんの指揮下に入りま
I
す
actually have a
メーガンさんが
different view,
構成
because I
し
feel that digitalization is very empowering to creators. And when you think about a phenomenon like YouTube and user-generated consumption, these
じゃ
are
あ JI も最初から
forces. Similarly, digitalization has allowed the falling of distribution barriers. So not only is production much easier, but the ability to distribute it to people is much easier. And we're really living in a golden age of entertainment with many more choices than we have. And that also means a greater democratization of ideas. And again, all of this is happening on a global scale, which is really
目立
enabled
たしすまん
by
ね
digital technology.
あのねバカみたいにバカ
Okay, well, what is actually the biggest threat from cybersecurity for Europe? Because we can concentrate
残念だったね
on the security side, but
セーバー
I'm
ね
thinking a bit
ごめ
on
ん
the other side that if we
Ma pari.
really go to focus too much on the
Pari
security side, then it really would slow down our development. I think it is the biggest threat is that we lose competitiveness. And that is for me the whole part, because if we want to be leaders in innovation, we should also know innovation, it has two aspects. First, I think you must have a great idea, but you must be the first. So that means speed. And we must make sure that I think we have an ability to be innovative and to be the first and to have speed. So for me, that is the biggest threat of cybersecurity, to get slowed down.
suffering from eco-anxiety? The simple answer is yes, possibly too much. Eco-anxiety is definitely triggered by the fact that we are facing a very urgent matter with climate, but at the same time, it's also
アメリカ製ブルじゃなくて、もうアメリカ分裂してるってもうこれでも分かる通り、もう崩壊してる。メーガンさんが指揮してます、今。メーガンことね、オーサリバン委員長が今、ビルダーバーグの副議長格のこの方が今指揮してます。CSIS の指揮してます。あれやったな。わかるこれ。今フランス共和国に入ってナナ君、君日本に残っといて正解やったね。残っといて正解やった。エリザベス女王もね。やっぱり天皇に文句言ったか。斎藤警部から。もう知ってた。ちなみに FBI ね。メンズたち、そう。実はね、そう。実はあのメンズたち、そう。日本に。日本が。そう来たんや警視庁のそうびっくりしたそうここもセイワールでしたこれでも分かる通りねもうそう分かるこれ滋賀県攻撃しろってそう要求し始めたなそうアメリカ議会占領事件大事やなこれむっちゃびっくりしたユージ覚悟しろお前
In Russia, political competition is limited, there are no real opposition parties, so the society stands up to the autocratic regime through organizing itself, through building
アメリカ軍ね、ほとんどね、もう
goods that the corrupt and inefficient state cannot provide. And it's not just protesting corruption, it's not just about asking for democracy and rule of law. Civil society today is working on helping the disadvantaged, fighting domestic violence.Promoting gender equality, defending minorities. So this is actually where the European future for Russia is. And luckily, with the new communication technology, with internet, it's easier to organize itself, it's easier to inform itself, and it's easier to promote change, creating new Russia that eventually will become part of Greater Europe.
いやカンパニーさあこの方本当にびっくりしたねじゃあアメリカの委員会ね3局のもうあれねこの方が言ってましたさあもう解体する方針決めました解体する方針決めました
When citizens in Moldova and Georgia are questioning whether Europe and the US will come to rescue if there is a security guarantee, and when sanctions against Russia and counter embargoes have become kind of the very essence of the idea of a European security policy, well, what can we expect from Russia? We know that Putin is actually more popular than most of his competitors. But will Medvedev be a different leader than Putin? In short, can we expect a different kind of trajectory from Russia in the coming years when the bureaucratic elite inside Russia is focusing more on digitalization than what some might call modernization? As always, the views on Russia are diverging.
Developments in these last few years are showing us that the strength of the EU relative to individual countries is not constant over time. I believe we can say that the EU is strongest towards candidate countries. When a country wishes to accede to the European Union or to the Eurozone, it tends to follow the suggestions and the prescriptions of the EU as much as possible to make progress. And that is the moment when the magnet effect of European integration is really great, and by the way has induced countries in the past, if we think of the Balkans for example, also to establishing better relations among each other in order to qualify for membership of the EU. Then the problem is that sometimes relative vis-à-vis member states, the EU is not so strong in terms of leading them to respect its own rules as pro-Europeans would like to see. And we can even see in recent years, for example, a greater leniency in terms of allowing infringements of the Stability and Growth Pact. But then the most recent experience is how difficult it is for a country to leave the European Union if it so decides. And the monumental example of Brexit shows us that vis-à-vis a member state which wants to leave the European Union, the European Union still has quite a remarkable power. We have seen in the case of the negotiations on Brexit the EU displaying really unexpected unity among the 27, also thanks to the skills and determination of Chief Negotiator Michel Barnier, and we are seeing how difficult it is for the UK to get its act together. And this, in my view, should be also kept in mind by countries here and there where governments play with the idea of perhaps leaving one day the EU or the Eurozone. They better keep in mind that it is tremendously difficult. If it is proving to be so difficult for a country of the standing, the experience, the administration of the quality of the UK, I don't want to imagine other specific examples of countries where the politicians sometimes say, let's get rid of the EU. Not only I have no idea where those countries will end up, but also they will suffer very, very much in the process.
When one thinks about the 2015 migration crisis, it is true that we have gone a long way as a European continent. And we've gone a long way because in 2015 we were hit with a massive crisis. Hundreds of thousands of migrants coming to Europe's shores. And that is not the case anymore. It is true that the overall numbers have decreased. But is that enough? Is it enough to just look at the overall numbers? Or should one also focus on what's happening within each EU country? And I say that because there are certain EU countries, such as Greece, such as Italy, such as Spain, which have taken a far greater hit than others when it comes to migration crisis. And yes, the numbers are overall down, but problems do persist in countries like the ones I just mentioned. So the question one needs to ask is, has Europe done enough in order to alleviate the effects of the crisis throughout the entire EU 28? Has Europe done enough in order to share burdens? And I say that particularly because when one looks at the figures regarding relocation of refugees across Europe, then one will realize that not enough has been done in that direction. And so one is led to the question, what kind of Europe do we want? Do we want a Europe where we all share the benefits of Europe, or do we also want a Europe where the countries also share burdens?
Well, now it is the end of the Ljubljana meeting, which was a great meeting. We have had excellent discussions, we have learned a lot, and we have thought a lot. And now I hope to see you in Paris next June. It will be a plenary session, and all of us, we shall be there. So please do come to Paris.
So I'm Jane Harmon, and the question is, what is the future of political parties? I can speak to the U.S. more than anywhere else. I was a member of our Congress for 9 terms and left because it became so partisan and dysfunctional. At the Wilson Center, we study this, and there are some remedies to the problems. But bottom line, in the U.S., our tradition is 2 parties only. In Europe, there are multi-party systems in most countries, and we're seeing the rise of populist parties. In the U.S., we have no populist party. We have a Republican Party that is now dominated by our president, and we have a Democratic Party where most of the noise is coming from the far left. What we don't have is anything to represent the center, and that is the challenge for the U.S. going forward. That is something I work on, and that is something that the Wilson Center is hoping to improve, because if we are to convey at least a majority view in the United States, essential to making our foreign policy and domestic policy effective, we need to reach for the center so that we have both parties participating. And hopefully we'll advance that goal here at the Trilateral Commission.
So we had a marvelous meeting in Stockholm. We could address all the issues that are of very great importance for the European and also at a global level. It was marvelously organized by the host of the Swedish chapter, and we appreciated enormously their organization. All the panelists were very, very stimulating and interesting. Many provisional conclusions are coming from this meeting, including the fact that the European wants to be more assertive, perhaps, than they were before in many domains, including the digitalization, the platform at a global level, including industry and research and services at a global level. This idea that Europe as a whole should be, again, more present in the global conversation came very much out of this meeting, which was, again, very comprehensive and stimulating. But you will see that in the various video, perhaps, that you would like to see. Now, I have to give you a new rendezvous. We have rendezvous in Washington, because it would be the trilateral at the level of the 3 pillars of the trilateral, the entire world, if I may. And this is a Washington meeting which will take place in March 13 to 15. And so there we are with a big rendezvous which would be important, and where we could discuss the global issues in the tradition of the trilateral, with a vision of an open world, a free world, a world which is taking stock of science, technology, and the new wave of innovation, and also respect our fellow citizens, is attached to democracy, is attached to equality produced by the working of a market economy, a vivid market economy. So, à bientôt.
I think that the relations between Russia and the European Union are in the stalemate right now. There has been no major movement in either direction since the European Union accepted the so-called five Federica Mogherini principles almost 4 years ago. Both sides apparently believe that time is playing on their side and they can sit on their hands waiting for something to change. However, I think that on both sides we see more and more fatigue and more intention to start gradually rebuilding this relationship. I do hope that if the Normandy summit in France turns out to be moderately successful, we might see new openings because, of course, Ukraine remains the major stumbling block on the way to better relations between Moscow and Brussels. If we are able to create at least some positive dynamics there, it would be easy to proceed on other issues where Russia and the European Union have common interests.
Does the European Union need its own army? Well, here's what I think. The vision of a European army is actually a useful vision because it is good to know what the long-term goal might be. But is the European army something we can put together right now? No. And why not? First and foremost, because the European Union does not even have the mechanism to come up with clear political decisions and to speak with one voice in crisis. So the first step which we in the European Union need to take together is to change our decision-making process. We need to go from consensus to qualified majority voting. We need to learn that all of us, whether we are 27 or 28, will only be listened to, will only be respected, and can only be a military actor in the world if we speak with one voice. And that requires majority voting. So that's step number one. And the next steps are capabilities, and we will need to work on that also. And then we can think of the long-term vision of a European army.
I don't think anyone wins in trade conflicts, and even the word war is, I think, a bit overstated because wars end up being zero-sum. One wins, one loses, and in the case of trade, it should be a win-win operation. So I think the analogy is mistaken, and by closing off your own markets, you increase costs to your own people. In the United States, about 50% of imports are for commodities or intermediate goods, so if you raise those costs, you raise costs for manufacturers and consumers in the United States, or same would be the case in Europe. And in the case of the U.S. and China, I think that we're in a very dangerous situation. I think that there are many reasons and frustrations with China. Some of them are justifiable about forced technology transfer, intellectual property rights, reciprocity. There's also concerns about Chinese security and other policies. But I think you can find allies within China on a number of the trade issues, and you actually want to try to keep pushing both sides to a rules-based system. So I think that the path that we're on with China has led to more of confrontation. And in fact, what you're probably going to need to see is some combination of competition, cooperation, and confrontation, or at least drawing lines on some issues. So I think with a country as big as China, you need a more multifaceted policy.
I would say that the characteristics of a Nordic education system is that, first of all, we have a very inclusive system based on public funding where there should be room for all. I think students are taught to think independently, a lot of critical thinking, and also quite a lot of creativity baked into our education. I would especially commend the Finnish system where they put their best teachers for the youngest students, and they use a lot of resources in preschool and also first to third grade to ensure that the children are best possibly equipped for future learning. And I believe that that's the best investment you can make, is to invest in the kids when they're really young, so you lay the foundation for their future learning.
Liberal democracy can survive the current period of disruption, but it's going to have to change. The volatility and the risks that we are witnessing across much of the Western world are anchored in some very deep changes that have been swirling beneath our democracies, that have been coming for many years and still have a long way to run. They relate to strong feelings of distrust in the political system, widespread fears over the perceived destruction of ways of life, national identity, big worries over deprivation, the way in which the economic settlement is playing out, and weakening bonds between the mainstream parties and ordinary voters. Those four currents have been with us for a very long time, before the Great Recession, before the arrival of Facebook and Twitter and big tech. But they are now producing very substantive political effects, and they will continue to produce substantive political effects. So liberal democracy has to change. It has to make its political systems more representative. It has to ensure that people feel that their nations and communities are secure and have strong and robust external borders. And it also, over the long term, needs to devise an economic settlement that ensures that everybody feels that they are relatively getting the gains and the benefits that other groups in society are getting as well. Very big challenges, no clear answer as to now. The ball is very much in liberal democracy's court.
So bringing trilateral to Slovenia means also bringing Slovenia to trilateral. And as you know, David Rockefeller Fellows had a pre-program. It is our pleasure that we connected them at the MCHM breakfast with Slovenian Business Society. They were talking about the global issues and how connected the world is, with some local representatives and even some members of Trilateral. It is also our pleasure that the former Prime Minister, who is the current Minister for Foreign Affairs, Dr. Miro Cerar, had the time to meet with them and discuss where the Europe is today and where the Europe is going. And of course, we have finished our program with amazing lunch with Professor Dana Zohar. No, liberal
democracy will not survive in an unchanged form. It has not been changing enough to accommodate the vast, speedy development of the internet and of the communication technologies. And it has been changing too much, given the rather static nature of men.
Do you have a crystal ball? We are in the middle of a psychodrama in Britain, political and social, and it's very hard to predict how will end up. Parliamentary drama, a drama inside the Conservative Party, and a drama in the country at large. I do not think it is certain that the British will leave the European Union.
Protectionism is never a good solution for trade, because in the long run it will endanger the competitiveness of everyone. The European car industry, whether you talk about OEMs or whether you talk about such suppliers, is very competitive, is export-oriented, is very successful on world markets, but most of the companies are not only delivering cars to other parts of the world, they are also producing cars in those parts of the world, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in China, whether it's Southeast Asia, where they have a lot of success. That means in the long run, free trade is always the better solution for economy and for the countries which want to safeguard jobs and prosperity.
A quantum leader is a new paradigm leader who realizes that the world is holistic. All things, all people, all problems are interconnected. There are no others. There is no separation. I am you, you are me. Thus, a quantum leader would say the problem of inequality very differently, or the problem of identity very differently, because we are not separate, atomistic, isolated individuals, and our problems are not separate, isolated, and animistic. A quantum leader is ethical, is moral, has compassion. A quantum leader is self-aware. A quantum leader celebrates diversity. A quantum leader asks fundamental questions, always questioning him or herself, questioning assumptions, questioning the way things have been done, questioning the norm. Someone who lives at the edge of chaos, who shakes things up, who thrives on uncertainty,
そういうことや。
thrives on
ビル
chaos.
ドバーグに犬さん差し掛け
A quantum leader is filled with compassion, and a quantum leader feels called to lead, called to serve. There's a sense of purpose, a sense of higher meaning in his or her leadership. A quantum leader is a servant leader. He exists to serve others and to serve the world. Indeed, to serve the universe.
Well, there's no simple answer to that, to the issue of asymmetric attacks on democracies. The point being that you can disrupt elections in democratic elections in a democratic country. It's rather difficult to do it with an authoritarian regime, since they really don't have genuine elections. And so what are you going to do when you are attacked? I think we need a broad range of responses, beginning with looking at our electoral systems to ensure that they are proportional, so you don't have the kind of issues you had in the U.S. presidential elections, where because of the electoral college system, some states had far more weight. I think we need to look at the kind of electoral systems we have and make sure that we get a broad representation rather than a simple binary decision of a first past the post election system. We need to think about our asymmetric advantages. We have rule of law. That's pretty important. It's interesting that the authoritarian regimes all place their money abroad in places where there is rule of law. Why? Because in an authoritarian regime, you can just lose everything all at once. Someone takes your money. Whereas if it's in the West, or rather in a rule of law country, then that's unlikely. Well, maybe we can make it more difficult to keep your money here. Or we can be much more we definitely should be much more transparent about ownership. After all, much of the money laundering that we've seen from the authoritarian states that are attacking us goes through anonymous shell companies. These are, again, issues that need to be taken up by government authorities in order ultimately to defend democracy.
Silicon Valley provides a unique ecosystem, basically in some sense a network of having a very strong university that's very applied, that is all about working with the real world, doing basic research and then trying to put that basic research into the society, into the good. An important thing, I think, is also that it's a social network of sharing. Is that basically in California there is no non-competes, so people move around freely, and this means that the flow of innovation is much faster. The other important thing is the size, the critical mass, again, of very large amounts of talent, so that companies can be scaled up very quickly. For example, in my own experience, I started working with Pinterest when there was less than 200 of us. 3 years later, there is a few thousand of us. And company culture and everything wasn't lost, and the new people got hired. And then I think the last thing is that universities, as well as kind of companies, focus less on protecting their IP and really trying to move as fast as possible. Because if we think about innovation is about moving fast, and it's not so much about building walls and figuring out how to do the next step very carefully. It's really about running and iterating fast. And if we run and iterate fast, then the success will be there, and kind of little details don't matter that much. And I think this is important from the viewpoint of university, letting the research be put in the public domain and really benefit the environments in which the university's professors operate, as well as in terms of companies sharing the information and flow of people with each other. So there is, for example, in Silicon Valley, a lot of different seminars, people from one company visiting the other company, sharing quite openly actually what they are doing, writing academic papers, again talking about their latest solutions, so that we are all up to date, and the entire system can kind of help each other in terms of making the most innovation and the most progress in the short amount of time. Because I think the question is not can we innovate, but the question is, or can we invent something? But the question about innovation is, can we be the first ones to do something? So it's as much about the speed as it is about the substance.
We had a really good discussion today. Reviving the European dream is what we really want. The next year will be the election for the European Union, for the Parliament of the European Union, and it is really important that there will be a strong mandate. One of the challenges we are facing at the moment is still the migration crisis. And also the priority of the Austrian presidency is security and the fight against illegal migration. So we had a good discussion today on all these topics, and of course there are different opinions on this. But in general, we are always on the same line. We want to have a solution for the European Union and for Europe. Safe external borders and legal migration, because Europe will need it in the end. But people still have in front of their eyes the migration flood in 2015, and therefore it is really important to have a good solution, and a solution which will be implemented in all the countries of the European Union, to have a resilient European asylum system.
Migration is currently one of the key issues of European citizens, and my view is that it will remain so, especially because migration is here to stay, and it will probably increase in numbers and complexity because of the political consequences of wars, the terrorism, but also because of the climate change. I think, in my view, migration is needed in Europe. I think it's something that we can benefit from, and I think that we need to change the narrative on this. First and foremost, us as politicians. Actually, the demographic of Europe says that migration is something that we will need in the future in order to maintain and grow our economic development, the quality of life. And I think that we should also go back to the European shared values and human values that are, I think, the foundation stone of Europe, so that together we can change, as I said, the narrative and help these people, but also help ourselves grow and develop further. Thank you.
Turkey belongs to European family, you know. There is no way that Turkey can distance itself from the realities of Europe. Today, of course, at the Trilateral Commission, we are going to discuss three scenarios: confrontation, cooperation, and membership of Turkey to the EU. In these three scenarios, of course, there are different outcomes. What I would say that confrontation between Turkey and the EU is a complete lose-lose scenario. And if it is only cooperation instead of membership of Turkey to the EU, this will be some sort of limited cooperation, and it will be a scenario in which both Turkey and the EU will not be able to enjoy the full potential. In economics, we say, you know, this is not cost effective at all. But when it comes to EU membership, I would say that this will mean full use of potential of Turkey and the EU together. This means a stronger, stable, respected, fully democratic Turkey, but this also means in the world scene a global actor of EU, peace-bringing EU, welfare-creating EU, employment-creating EU. So I would say that in this case, membership case, the outcome would be win-win-win. So win for Turkey, win for the EU, but also win for beyond.
You will have to define what you mean by Europe and the European Union having its own army. I do not think Europe needs its own army for what I would qualify as the classical Article 5 NATO scenario. In other words, in a conflict with Russia. But Europe should definitely, the European Union should definitely develop the possibility to project hard power without the United States of America. I can imagine a scenario in Northern Africa where you have a combination of terrorism, climate change, migration. It's an ungoverned part of Africa, largely, where Boko Haram meets al-Qaeda, where al-Qaeda meets Daesh. In other words, it's not
階段に
impossible
期待しないっ
to get the French
て言ってますね
and are
さあ
doing
足ようか
that you would need to intervene militarily,
Leon.
and then the European Union would be on its own.
Bilderberg
Second scenario,
Bilderberg
virtual but not impossible, when in the Balkans the demons of the past would raise again. And we should not repeat a situation like we had in the 90s of the previous century, where finally Bill Clinton and the United States of America had to come in to stabilize the situation. I could think about the need for border protection, external border protection, with military means. You're a bit on the border here between the military and the military police, the gendarmerie in French. In other words, if that is meant by President Macron and Chancellor Merkel with a European army, I can follow them. What we should not forget, by the way, is when you talk about European military intervention, that's why I like the qualification European army not much, is that there will always be national parliaments who will decide if those soldiers will be sent into harm's way. So they will not, I hope, talk about a European command and a European parliament which decides this goes to the heart of the sovereignty of nations, and those nations will want to decide themselves. I see the way out as presented by President Macron of France, the European Intervention Initiative, where you can build coalitions of the willing outside the EU institutions. You can build coalitions of the willing, which you will always need for such kind of military operations. Advantage of a coalition of the willing is that after Brexit you can keep Great Britain on board, because they will not anymore be a member of the European Union. At the same time, PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation, should of course continue. Important project, but rather bureaucratic and rather cumbersome. So that would be my answer to the question, does Europe need its own army?
What can we do in order for democracy to survive? So I would like that to be the main theme for our conversation, and I can simply leave it with that and ask you, so what does it take and what can we do?
じゃあこれ見せようか証拠
I should tell you first what I've been talking to people about. So, my wife and I have been on a 100-city tour since January. And I've spoken to about 250,000 people over the course of that. In Australia, New Zealand, and throughout the US and Canada. Some in Europe, mostly in the UK and the Scandinavian countries, coming back here in March and April to go through the South and the East. When I speak to audiences, I always watch people one by one, because I never speak to the crowd. And I always listen to the entire audience, because what I'm trying to manage when I'm speaking is to put everybody in the same place so that there's dead silence. Because if there's dead silence, that means that everybody's concentrating on the same thing, and that everybody has come to a collective agreement that that thing is of substantive importance. And the most reliable means of silencing an audience of 2,500 people, regardless of where that is around the world, is to make a strong case for the relationship between suffering, meaning, and responsibility. And the case for suffering, I think, is quite obvious, because one of the things that I point out to my listeners is that life has a tragic element, and we all are perfectly aware of that, and that we're subject to that as fragile
か
accept voluntary responsibility for those preconditions and then working to rectify them. And the corollary of that is that it's almost inevitably the case that people find the meaning that sustains themselves through suffering and that enables them to be motivated sufficiently to constrain their own malevolence is to be found in the adoption of responsibility. And it's surprising that a message that has that much weight, let's say, and that little frivolity, because there's no frivolity, let's say, in that,
もう最悪な結果だった。
silences people. Can democracy survive? Well, first of all, if you ask the typical person in a democratic society whether they would like it to survive, the resounding answer to that is going to be yes. The people who are working to undermine it are a tiny radical fringe on both ends of the political distribution, let's say, with a disproportionate amount of exposure and power. And the people in the middle are lost in some sense without a uniting narrative. And a huge part of the narrative that has united democratic countries since their foundation isn't the doctrine of rights. And it's not the doctrine of individual happiness. It's the doctrine that the individual is the sovereign foundation of the polity and maybe of the cosmos itself, which is something that I happen to believe, given the important role that consciousness plays in existence itself, and that it's useful and necessary to call to people to remind them of their responsibility as sovereign individuals. And so I'm encouraging people to develop a vision for their life, to adopt full responsibility for themselves in a manner, and not in a manner that pertains specifically to their narrow self-interest or happiness, but to something that's much broader in scope, to think that each person should take on the voluntary requirement to take care of themselves, but also their future selves, because each of us is a collective that stretches across time, and whatever you do impulsively in the present merely means that you sacrifice yourself in the future, and that's not a sustainable or intelligent solution. And you want to take on responsibility for yourself and your future selves in a way that's of maximal benefit to your family, if you can manage that. And then perhaps if there's something left over in terms of your capability, then you can do both of those things in a way that maximally supports and serves the community. And for many young people, that's something they've never heard, is that we've made a very bad case, all of us, I would say, that each of these people, each person, has that sovereign responsibility, and that if they adopt it, that actually constitutes something of singular importance. And that's an old religious idea, in some sense, that each person has a soul, let's say, that is somehow a center of reality itself, and that needs to be manifested in life itself, and that if it isn't manifested, then something of tremendous value is not brought forward, and worse, and this is the end of the case, let's say, and worse, to the degree that that's not brought forward, then something hellish moves in to take its place. And people understand this sort of thing a lot more clearly than you might think if you explain it to them as if they might understand. And then it gives them a series of purposeness that straightens out their life. And so my sense is the way that you revivify democracy is by remembering its fundamental insistence that the individual is at the cornerstone of the state, and that everything you can possibly do to fortify the individual simultaneously, the individual is the eyes of the state, is that where the living individual is the eyes of the dead state, and the living individual revivifies the state. And to the degree that
やっぱ
of one form or another,
と
or
ころで
they
神田
collapse
正
into
輝
a
が
kind
出
of
てた
nihilism that's completely counterproductive. And so, well, so that's been my experience.
So this morning we had a session on the future of mobility, and we actually discussed what does it mean for the auto industry and what does it mean for the cities. If you look at the auto industry, there has never been as much change as there is today. On the technology side, with connectivity, electrification, autonomous driving, on the social domain, with sharing, more urbanization and new ways of working, and also on the regulation side, where it's about emission control and standards, and also on regulation for managing congestions in the city. So we actually covered that. We also talked about what does it actually mean for the cities? How will actually the traffic evolve if you have more AVs and individual mobility through AVs? What would be levers to actually work on getting a mitigation on traffic and basically how to deal with heightened traffic from autonomous
バーニング覚悟しろ
tech of actually sharing more cars, of basically having smaller or basically bus-based autonomous vehicles, and actually how would you deal with occupancy-based pricing? How would you actually work as a city to make the whole modal mix work and in the end get to a better transportation for the whole city?
We had a conversation yesterday in the dinner with Nigel Higgins on, I would say, the crisis, the causes of the great financial crisis, and whether or not we are in a situation where we could expect new major difficulty, taking into account what we have done since the crisis that erupted in 2007-2008. I have to say that the questions which were asked by Nigel were very, very stimulating. I could embark on explaining that, in my opinion, it was very much a multi-dimensional causes that we had to cope with. We had certainly the over-indebtedness that had accumulated from year 2000 up to 2007-2008. Approximately 25% of the global GDP as an additional public and private debt outstanding. That was a major cause. Another cause was the new emerging properties of the new global finance system with the impact of technology, new IT technologies and globalization. And amongst the properties, the emerging properties that I could witness myself when I was president of the ECB in 07, 08, 09, 10, 11, was that the contagion was taking place extraordinarily rapidly. You know, in the old times, you would expect that a major shock here would be transmitted to the rest of the world as a matter of months or even quarters. In the new world in which we are, it's a matter of half days. And we could experience that in 08, dramatically, obviously, with the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And we have other causes that are also important because, as I said, it's multidimensional. But I stress that the two causes that I mentioned just now, namely these emerging properties and the rapidity of contagion on the one hand, and the debt overburdening the global economy are still there. And we, particularly as regards the level of the debt outstanding, public and private, as a proportion of global GDP, we continue to have a piling up of debt more or less at the same pace after the crisis as before the crisis. And this is worrying, and it calls for extreme vigilance, obviously, and hard work to complete all what we have done and should do. Again, to prevent the new crisis, and if we have to